Right, I'm now turning to Rupa Huq. Rupa.
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to return to some of those kind of grey areas, or I don't know, gaping holes that the Chair started off with in the beginning, the things that were maybe requested and then not granted. I'm guessing Erasmus was one of those, because that's not in the agreement at all. And I just noticed the way that this has been spun as a Christmas Eve miracle. Ever since, I think the Home Secretary has been quoted as saying that we will be safer now than before. I just wondered what the three of you thought of that claim, seeing as, you know, these databases, loss of direct access means things certainly will be slower, I'd have thought, and we're not in the European arrest warrants. I just wondered, I hope it's not one of those things that there's no objective truth to, what the three of you thought. Will we be safer? Will things be slower? In any order. I think Catherine is at the top of my screen, so yeah.
I'm afraid I disagree with the Home Secretary to say that we'll be safer now than we were before. The UK was highly instrumental in setting up all of these mechanisms when we were still a member of the EU, and the fact is a number of them have been turned off. Or we've been refused access to them. In particular, the SIS2 database, and I think we use that about 600 million times a year. So it's something really quite serious. That said, where I was pleasantly surprised in this agreement was how much had been agreed on law enforcement issues and criminal cooperation, notably not civil cooperation, which is a major loss for the commercial courts in this country. But in respect of criminal matters, yes, we have lost access to some of the databases, but what we have got is something not too dissimilar, and it will be slower, more clunky, and it will require quite a lot of work of the relevant specialised committee to try and actually get this to work harmoniously. But the fact is, it's far better than a no-deal Brexit, when we would have had access to none of this stuff. As you say, we've got no longer access to the European arrest warrant, but what you find in the European surrender agreement is something which is not that far short of the European arrest warrant. Yes, there's some more caveats, and it may be that states take advantage of the possibility that they can refuse to extradite their own nationals. But in fact, what the European arrest warrant is more often used for is to get British people back to the UK from, for example, Spain, than trying to get Latvians back into the UK. So the fact is that the European surrender agreement is there, I think, is a positive step.
Yeah, Raoul is next on my little tessellated tiles.
Well, look, I mean, I don't think I'm qualified to judge how safe the UK is. So, you know, I don't think it's for me to make that judgment. But look, I agree with Catherine's analysis. I think personally, I had low expectations in this area, given where the negotiations had been going and the difficulty given the red lines of both sides on this issue. I think as soon as you have, you know, the risk constraints of, you know, no regulatory alignment, no European Court of Justice, the security agreement and the level of ambition inherent in that drops significantly. And so, you know, I always was of view that this would be quite a difficult negotiation, but as Catherine has touched on, there are positives there, and particularly the replacement for the European arrest warrant and how close it gets to the current system is a positive. So look, it is a step down in terms of access and data sharing from where we are now, but in the scheme of the negotiations and where things had been heading, it from my personal perspective, it seems to have come out slightly better than I had expected.
And Sam, is it a downgrade?
So I'm going to speak specifically about safety and security in the trade space, because I have actually heard an argument made by people in government that the reintroduction of safety and security declarations, which are part of the new bureaucracy that people exporting goods or importing goods in and out of the UK have to deal with provides greater information to the UK agencies about what's actually coming into the UK and leaving it. So in that sense, this extra bureaucracy, whilst a big cost for business, does provide Border Force with more information from which to assess what's in the, you know, the risk levels of trucks entering and leaving the UK. So from that perspective, I suppose you could argue that there is more information available in a certain instance that can allow us to protect our borders or make decisions in the security space. But it is also, it speaks to your broader question of absences from the agreement, because it is also possible that we would have negotiated a waiver on the safety and security declaration, similar to what the Swiss have with the EU and the Norwegians have with the EU, and remove this bit of bureaucracy for businesses, and we chose not to. And to me, that then I then have the question: why did we not try and negotiate it? And one of the arguments you could make is because the UK wanted to have more information about who's exiting and leaving the UK for security purposes. I'm not sure I necessarily agree with all of this. I'm not sure I'm qualified to have an opinion on it, but I do think it's an interesting avenue to explore.
I think it's going to be coming up again in the questions in more detail. But the fact that we have an 80% service economy, I mean, again, it seems a lot of these things, financial services is one of these kind of TBC things that is a bit of a fill in the blanks. There's a further memorandum of understanding to come. And, you know, there's probably more people in the borough of Ealing employed in that than, you know, Fisher people in the whole country. But look, the chair talked about mutual recognition of qualifications. How useful do you think that the provisions are in the agreement for that, as is? And who is it that's going to decide? Is it professional bodies within each member state on a bilateral basis?
So on your question, and just starting in general with the services point, I think it's important to remember that whilst a large proportion of the economy is services orientated, in terms of our trade, it's more evenly split between goods and services. And we, if you take the data at face value, we trade more in goods than we do in services. I don't necessarily think we should take the services data at face value. I think it misses a lot, but just important to remember. But in terms of the provisions within the agreement, from the moment the UK chose to extricate itself from the EU's regulatory infrastructure and to reject freedom of movement, the options when it came to services in the context of an agreement were always going to be limited. Free trade agreements don't do much to facilitate trade in services. They lock in existing levels of access, which is useful from an investment perspective, but beyond that, they're not the place you go to liberalise trade in services, because to liberalise trade in services, you largely need regulatory harmonisation in order to get regulators on board and to trust each other. Otherwise, you're left with equivalence type discussions, which is where we are, where there are unilateral decisions taken by countries to allow certain things to happen or not, but they don't bind themselves to those decisions. In terms of mutual recognition of professional qualifications, it's very similar to Canada, EU-Canada, and to be honest, EU-Canada provisions on mutual recognition of professional qualifications don't work. They're not very useful. They haven't led to any actual recognition of qualifications. I think there's always a rumour that the architects are going to get recognised at some point, but it hasn't happened. So what we're left with are attempts by UK, either at government level or at independent qualification body levels, attempts to... Oops, sorry.
Sorry, I think that's an antiquated landline that everyone else is ignoring.
I don't think I've encountered one. As a millennial, I'm not sure if I've ever encountered a landline. But
sorry.
But in terms of mutual recognition of qualifications, what we're left with, I think, on the basis of this agreement, and it's good that the agreement didn't shut down this avenue, is either the UK as a government or respective qualification bodies in the UK operating bilaterally with their counterparts on the continent to try and ensure recognition of qualifications that way. It doesn't look like it's going to happen on an EU-wide basis anytime soon, although the possibility is there because it is something that can be built upon over time.
The other two, do you have anything to add, Raoul? You were in that negotiating space for quite a long time.
No, I mean, I think I agree with Sam. The best thing I can say about mutual recognition professional qualifications here is that it's not actively unhelpful, which it would have been if it didn't include this ability for the bilateral agreements to be struck. And I think that was a big ask of the professional services, professional business services industry, was to say, look, if you can't get what you're asking for on mutual recognition of professional qualifications, at least don't shut off the bilateral routes, because that can quite quickly create a useful patchwork of agreements. But if everything had to go through the EU level, it would have been slow and onerous and quite political. And so I think, the best we can say, as I said, is that it's not actively unhelpful, and hopefully these bilateral routes can quickly establish some agreements.
Is there space for this being one of these TBC things further down the line? Or, yeah, Catherine.
Could I just answer your broader question about what's missing? And the most obvious, very large area, which is not touched upon at all in the agreement, is, of course, foreign policy, which was already identified as an area in the political declaration for agreement. Now, clearly, there's been a policy decision taken that this should not be done via the EU, but should be done on a more bilateral basis with certain European partners. But it's clearly quite important for the UK to work out what it wants to do in this area, specifically over the fact that we've got COP26 taking place in Glasgow at the end of the year, and how we're going to work with our European partners in order to try and deliver some of these very ambitious objectives. And of course, it's not just climate change, it's how to deal with Iran, how to deal with the other pressing international problems. And there is no framework at all for that in this treaty. Now, that's not the end of the world, because even under the CFSP, it was more of a framework than that. It didn't actually deliver some of the big changes that's still done on a largely bilateral basis. But nevertheless, there is nothing here. So to answer your question, that is an obvious gap.
And that includes international aid, defence, the whole lot.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Anyone else want to add anything on foreign cooperation?
Okay.
No. Oh,
right.
okay, that's me then.
Thank you very much indeed, Rupa.